Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution. It really is a great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar entitled Education and Structural Inequalities During COVID-19. How do Finland and the U.S. compare? As both a U.S. citizen and a retired Marine Corps general, I have firsthand experience and seen the enormous inequalities that pervade our societies, both in this country and across the world. Often these inequalities reflect long-standing social practices, such as discrimination due to race or ethnicity or country of origin. But COVID-19 has created these inequalities. COVID-19 has not created these inequalities. It has, in fact, laid them bare. And in many cases, made them much worse, exacerbating whole systems of inequality. In the US, we've seen how low-income Black and brown citizens are much more likely to be exposed to this disease. And they're also more likely to suffer severe consequences from the virus as compared to their white counterparts. Across the developing world, we're seeing how social distancing is almost impossible in some crowded cities and in many workplaces where informal jobs and day-to-day wages are very low. Further, in communities both in the United States and across the world, access to high-quality public services, including both education and health, is very unevenly distributed. The stark reality is this, that poor and disadvantaged populations of the world are today more vulnerable than they were prior to COVID-19. Due to the tragic and unjust deaths of several Black Americans in recent weeks, diverse communities across our country are fiercely and rightly demanding that policies and programs are put in place to improve the opportunities of Black, brown, and Native American communities. These policies and programs need to begin with education opportunities. We know of no greater lever for social mobility and individual autonomy and well-being than access to quality education. Finnish students are consistently among the top performers in international assessment of skills, such as the OECD's Program for International Student Assessment, commonly known as PISA. But equally impressive is that the achievement gap between the students from wealthy and poor households in Finland is also among the lowest in the world. So we're delighted today to bring to you Finland's current Minister of Education, Ms. Li Andersson, and Dr. John King, CEO of the Education Trust and former U.S. Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama. My colleague, Emiliana Vegas, is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. And she's going to moderate what I'm certain is going to be a fascinating conversation on education and structural inequality. Before I turn it over to Emiliana, I want to thank the movement and the great support that we get from the Center for Universal Education's Leadership Council donors, who provide essential unrestricted support to the center, which allows us to take up these important and timely conversations. So with that, again, Madam Minister, Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. And Emiliana, over to you for today's conversation.
Thank you, John. As John mentioned just now, COVID-19 did not create inequalities, but has laid them bare. And these structural inequalities in many countries start with education. At the same time, education is perhaps one of the main mechanisms for societies to reduce inequality and for individuals to be able to live healthy, productive, and fulfilling lives. Around the world, the impact of school closures on student learning will vary by socioeconomic status and the extent to which schools can provide quality education remotely. While Finland and the United States are on their face both wealthy nations, they have very different levels of structural inequality and have historically approached educational opportunity with distinct policy lenses. Given these contrasts, it is not surprising that they make very different decisions regarding school closures and reopening in light of COVID-19. I am delighted to bring today two leaders from these countries, Finnish Minister of Education, Ms. Li Andersson, and former Secretary of Education of the U.S., Dr. John King, Jr. Minister Anderson has served as the Minister of Education of Finland since June 6, 2019. She has been the party leader of the Left Alliance since 2016. Before that, she chaired the Left Youth of Finland between 2011 and 2015, and she is now serving her second term as Member of Parliament. Welcome, Minister. We are delighted to have you. Secretary King is the President and CEO of the Education Trust, a U.S. nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close educational opportunity and achievement gaps. Dr. King served as U.S. Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. Prior to that role, Secretary King carried out the deputies of Deputy Secretary, overseeing policies and programs related to pre-K through 12th education, English learners, special education, innovation, and agency operations. Secretary King joined the department following his post as New York State Education Commissioner, and he began his career as a high school social studies teacher and middle school principal. It's an honor to have you with us, Secretary King. I will begin the conversation by asking them some questions, and then we will open the conversation to your questions. Many of you have already sent them, and viewers can email their questions to us while we are in this conversation at events@brookings.edu or tweet their questions using the hashtag #COVIDReopening. So I'll start with Minister Anderson. It is often argued that Finland's population is more homogeneous than that of countries such as the United States, and thus that ensuring equal educational opportunity is perhaps much easier for your country. Yet in my research on Finnish education reforms, I have been struck at how much the issue of inequality has been at the center of the policy debate. Can you describe for our audience the role that inequality, both socioeconomic, between rural and urban, with respect to new migrants or immigrants, has played in Finland's education policy discussions, and especially in the decision to close schools during the COVID-19 pandemic? Please unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. And firstly, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, which I really have been looking forward to. Although different countries have quite different educational systems and also somehow different educational policies, I really think that the theme of equality in education is one that really concerns us all, and where I think that we have a lot also to learn from the different policy choices that different countries has made and from their experiences. I think on a general level, if we talk about the role of equality and inequality in Finnish education policy debate, I would like to start out with saying that I think there is a very strong shared conception of how important the Finnish education system has been for making Finland into the country it is today. In the beginning of the 19th century, Finland was one of the least developed countries in Europe. And just 100 years later, we have been on top of different evaluations concerning welfare in different countries globally. And the most crucial way in which Finland built its welfare, in my opinion, was through its educational system and through understanding that especially a small country with a small nation really have the opportunity to use the human resources to full and really to use everyone's potential. So we cannot afford to leave anyone behind when we talk about education. In general, the Finnish education policy debate around equality, I would say that we have systemic strength in our system, which are important when we talk about education policy. For example, the differences between schools, when you look at learning outcomes, are the smallest in Finland of all the countries who have been participating in the PISA evaluation. And small differences between schools means that parents, students can trust that the school closest to their home in their own neighborhood is one of the best schools in the world. So there is no need to choose schools or to send your children away to get a good quality education. Another systemic strength that is very closely linked to this is the role of teachers' education, that you have a system where all teachers have a degree from a university. And through that, you can also make sure that you have a system with good quality education in all schools, and that all the teachers who are teaching also get a good salary and so on for the work that they do, so that the teacher's profession is one that's quite well looked upon in Finnish society. And also there's a lot of students applying to become teachers every year. If we look especially at the COVID crisis and the responses in terms of educational policy, I think in Finland, as in many other countries, one of the most important choices for us was, although we had to close the school buildings, we wanted education to continue. So all schools turned into distance learning during one day only, time for preparation. And through this, we wanted to make sure that no child was left behind, although it meant, of course, that the teaching had to be made in it was quite difficult, the circumstances for the teachers. And I think what we saw during the weeks this spring was really that the COVID and the distance learning, it revealed both inequality and innovation. It revealed inequality in terms of children not having the same possibilities to study at home, all children not having parents who have the possibilities to support them in their learning during the day, all children not having the devices that they might need, or families who might have no computers, only phones and so on. And also inequalities in terms of skills and competences needed to learn at a distance and the level of support available. But it also really provided us with an opportunity to rethink and think about our different teaching methods and models. And also a lot of teachers innovated new ways of supporting children, for example, children with special needs through distance learning. So you could also get school counseling and support for learning through these different types of teams and meets and these different types of programs that were used. So it was, I would say, it was both good and bad. It revealed good and bad in terms of our educational policy.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind viewers that you can email your questions. I'm sure many of you have new questions. Please do that by email to events@brookings.edu, or tweet your questions using the hashtag COVID reopening. Now I'll turn to Secretary King. It is striking that in the richest, most powerful country in the world, structural inequalities are pervasive, and the hurdles that Black and Brown and Native Americans face in accessing high-quality schools are as real today as they were in the 1960s. You have devoted your career to expanding access to quality education for all, and especially for students of color and from low-income families. What do you see as the main challenges to achieve educational opportunity for all in the U.S.?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I think the reality of American education is really a story of disparities. We have schools that provide incredible opportunities for some students, and we have other schools that struggle tremendously to provide an adequate education. Across the country, we sadly provide the least to the students who need the most. Low-income students and students of color are less likely to have access to quality early childhood education. They are less likely to be assigned to the strongest teachers. Their schools have, on average, significantly lower levels of spending. Their schools are less likely to be able to provide them with access to counselors, access to advanced coursework, access to a well-rounded education that includes science and social studies and the arts. And low-income students and students of color get less support in post-secondary transitions. So in every way, we have these tremendous disparities. And the consequence is that we see great disparities in college access, college enrollment, college completion, and disparities in our labor market, where the unemployment rate for African Americans and Latinos is often significantly higher than it is for white folks. But we have to acknowledge that all of this is very much grounded in our history as a country. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. My great-grandfather was enslaved about 25 miles from where I live. Slavery is very much a part of how our society has evolved. We have to remember that African Americans were forbidden by law to be educated during the period of enslavement. So we have a history from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining that helped to produce housing segregation, to the country's failure to fulfill the vision of Brown versus Board of Education and the Supreme Court's declaration that segregated schools were inherently unequal. Our failure to fulfill that vision, the fact that we still have schools that are so deeply segregated by race and class, drives so many of the inequities that we see. And as President Allen said, COVID-19 has put those disparities into sharper relief and exacerbated them.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Minister Anderson, Finland began reopening schools on May 10th. What were some of the most important factors that led to this decision to reopen schools? And as one of our audience members, David, wrote, why did you decide to open to schools when there were only a few weeks remaining of the school year? And also, what was the response of families? Did the majority of them send their students back to school?
Well, thank you. I think for the whole of government, when we discussed the issue of when and how to reopen the schools, I think it was important for all members of the cabinet and for the whole of government that schools shouldn't remain closed any longer than it's absolutely necessary to curb the spread of the pandemic. So we were listening to the national health authorities all the time. And at the point when the national health authorities told us that they think it's safe now to open up the schools, we also had quite a strong legal obligation actually to return to normal in terms of also securing the right of all children to return to school and to get education in the classrooms. So this was the reason, and throughout our pandemic response, of course, our primary concern is always curbing the spread of the pandemic. But as soon as the health authorities told us that they think it's safe, it also had a very big impact, I would say, on the attitudes of families, for example, because they knew that this was a decision based on what the health authorities were saying about what is safe for the children and young students. And I would say that the main worries that were also quite present in the public debate was firstly that, of course, a concern that learning at home is not the same thing as learning at schools, especially when you look at the situation for children who come from less privileged homes, whose parents do not have the time or the opportunity or maybe not the capabilities to support their children in their learning. We knew that all students were not participating in distance learning to the extent that we would have wanted. So a large number of teachers reported that they had a few single students who were not present during their online classes. And of course, the concern for the well-being of these students was very big. And also, which I think is important to stress as Minister of Education, is that the schools have a very big role to play in terms of the overall well-being of young children and young students. And it's not just about teaching math or teaching different subjects. You can do that through different types of or using digital devices and so on. But really that the school is also a place where children develop their social contacts. It has a huge importance in terms of social well-being. It's a place for many children where, that they meet safe adults, have a possibility also to interact with adults that are important in their lives. We have free school meals for all children each day in school in Finland. This was actually something that was considered very important also among the families. And I think that all of these factors also really played a very big role in the decision that we took to return to teaching in the beginning of May, or in the midst of May. And the responses I have gotten from parents has been mainly very positive. Around 90% of the students were present in the schools during these weeks in May. So around 10% were absent, mainly because their parents were afraid to send them to school at this point. But the main messages I have gotten from parents has been about joy of learning, actually, that their children were very happy to have the possibility to return to schools after 2 months of distance learning. And also many principals told them that they felt like it was like a second day of the year when they saw the happy faces of children, happy because they had the possibility to return to school. So I think this message about joy of learning was actually one that I'm going to take with me after the spring, and something that we should all policymakers should also remember when we talk about educational policy.
Thank you for that. That's very inspiring. And so I'll turn over to Secretary King. And it's such a contrast here in the United States because a majority of schools have been closed for now many months. And also we are going into the summer breaks, which also historically have led to learning losses, especially for those students from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So can you tell us a little bit of what you expect will be the impact of the school closures on students and how they will be differentially impacted based on their home environments and conditions at home?
Yeah. I mean, sadly, the impact will be felt most deeply by low-income communities and communities of color. We know there are disparities in the health impact and the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis, but there are also disparities in the educational impact. So first, around distance learning, we know that we already had a digital divide in this country. About 79% of white households have internet access, only about 66% of Black families and 61% of Latino families. So for some families, the schoolhouse door was barred because they didn't have internet access. We also know that low-income families and families of color were less likely to have devices. And it's not just a question of, do you have a device in the house, but you actually need a device for each child in the home to be working on their schoolwork simultaneously. So devices and internet access were a challenge. Low resource districts were less well prepared to switch to distance learning. We're able to provide less professional development for teachers to make distance learning good and engaging. African-American Latino communities were less well positioned in terms of parents' ability to support their kids' learning during the school day. Only about 1 in 5 African-Americans can work from home. Only about 1 in 6 Latinos can work from home. And so many kids were working on their own, or maybe they were taking care of younger siblings, or for high school students in low-income communities, maybe they were working themselves. It's very challenging to move forward on their schoolwork. And then Minister Anderson raised something really important, which is the role of relationships at school. And I worry a lot about the socio-emotional impact of the school closures. I think about kids who are experiencing health or economic trauma in their family because of COVID, but I also think about kids who are in homes where there's addiction, where there's abuse, where there's domestic violence. Kids for whom school might be the only place where they feel safe and supported and where they have positive relationships with adults and peers. And kids were without that for months. And so that's taking a toll as well. When kids come back in the fall, we expect to see learning loss, as you mentioned, Emiliana. McKinsey estimates that it could be as much as 7 months on average, 9 months for Latino students, 10 months of learning loss for African-American students. I fear we may see an uptick in dropouts from high school, students who never come back. We know when we've had natural disasters where there were school closures in the past, like Katrina or Maria, we've lost students as a result, students who never came back to school. And I worry about the socio-emotional gaps that students will carry into the school year, students who've experienced real challenges in their home. And we're going to need, as a country, to put resources towards addressing that learning loss and those socio-emotional needs. And I worry about whether or not Congress is going to step up in the way necessary to do that. The last point I'll make is that the COVID-19 economic crisis has had a devastating impact on state and local revenue. And so school districts are scared, rightly, that they may see 15, 20, 25% cuts in state aid going into the new school year. So you might see districts who should be providing more to make up for the COVID closures actually laying off teachers and cutting programs. So again, we really need federal leadership here to make sure there are the resources to support students.
Thank you. And that's actually a very good segue to the question I had for the minister, because when you did reopen, and I wanted to ask you, how did you evaluate both the learning losses, but also the potential, socio-emotional impact of the period in which different students were at home in different circumstances?
Our teachers used these 2 weeks to assess the learning loss. And I think they began to get a picture, but 2 weeks is not enough time for teachers really to be able to assess learning loss and also welfare loss on a more general scale for all students. So they will continue with this as soon as the school year starts in August. But what the government has done already was that we decided on quite a large support package for children. It was called the Children's Support Package, through which we gave additional state funding for the municipalities, for the schools especially, where the idea is that all children who have a need for additional teaching, for more support in their teaching in the fall, also should have a possibility to get that. It should not be a question of resources. And also giving additional resources to family services and for example, to the mental health services directed to young children and students. But we do know already, although the exact extent of the learning loss is hard to in just 2 weeks, but we do know already, based on research and data that we have from the spring, that there is a welfare loss, also like more general welfare loss concerning children and young adults. For example, the use of school health services dropped with more than 80% during the spring because the students were not physically in the schools where these services had been given. But I think it says a lot about what kind of loss we have to address in the fall. My main concern is we gave this children's support package from the government now, but I think what we need to remember is that this is something that we need to work with in the long run. So it's not just enough that we have additional measures for the fall, but we really need to evaluate and address these issues and think about it on a 2-year, 5-year, 10-year time frame to make sure that there is not any long-lasting consequences of this spring for these children. I think something that we learned in Finland is we had a very severe economic depression here in the 90s. And I think this is still an argument and an experience that is very relevant in the public debates here, because what the government did then in the 90s, what they did cutbacks in the funding for services for families and children. And we have a lot of research, extremely good quality research that has been done where they have followed the effects of those cuts in the welfare services for these children during decades afterwards, really kind of doing a long-term study to assess the long-term effects that these economic policy choices had for these children. And the results are very clear. I mean, the long-term effects are severe. they have an effect on inequality that you can see still when these children have become young adults. I know because I was born during the same year, so I'm part of the generation that was studied for years and decades to come. And I think we have used this argument in the public debate now. We have said time and again that we cannot afford to do the same mistakes that we did in the 90s and that we did in the economic depression then, but we really need to show the children that we have learned from our mistakes and that we understand that after a crisis like this, what we need is really to support education providers, make sure that there is additional funding and additional resources for the professionals that work with children, both in schools, but also in the welfare services and in social and health services, for example.
Oh, that's such a great message. And here in the U.S. too, I think when we had the latest Great Recession, I think there are some lessons to be taken from decisions that were made. And then I hope, as John was saying earlier, that Congress will make different decisions in this session. But I want to turn to some questions that we've gotten from some of our audience members. And there are a few questions related to the impact that COVID-19 may actually have in teaching practices and in how schools work in the future and how they relate to technology. So let me ask Secretary King first. Here's a question from Joey, who says, in your estimation, what does the future look like for traditional methods of teaching? He says he's currently working and studying to be a teacher, and all this online learning the past few months has made him uneasy that there may come a point where a physical classroom and a physical teacher are no longer needed, not to mention the calls from many to end schooling altogether. What are your thoughts?
Well, I appreciate the question. You know, to me, the education is really defined by the relationship between teachers and students and the work in which they're engaged. And relationships are central. So technology can be a tool that teachers use, but technology could never replace that relationship between teachers and students. I do think we've learned some things from distance learning around the country about how to use technology as a tool. Two important lessons. One is class has to be good. The technology itself is not engaging or compelling. It's the activities in which you are engaged. So those teachers who have had the most success with distance learning have figured out how to use the technology to make class interesting. They've had online debates, they've had performances, they've figured out ways to use technology. If we're studying ancient Egypt, let's go inside the ancient pyramids. They've figured out ways to have students work collaboratively on projects. So the technology, again, can be a platform, but you still have to plan for great engaging instruction. The other lesson that we've learned from kids working in an asynchronous format is that there's a set of skills that students need to work independently on their learning. And I've seen this as a parent. Kids need to be able to set goals. They need to be able to manage their time. They need to be able to ask questions when they need help. They need to be able to act on feedback that they're getting from their teacher when their teacher isn't sitting right there with them. And that set of skills around independent learning, around project-based learning, those are actually important skills for students to develop for college and career success. So I hope that as we come back to school, folks will look for opportunities to keep building that student agency that we've gotten to see during this period. But look, last point is the digital divide remains. And one of the things that worries me most going into the new school year is some schools are going to be hybrid. Some schools are going to have to go to distance learning because there's an uptick in the pandemic. And we can't be in the same place. We've got to make sure every kid has a device, every family has internet access, every teacher has the professional development they need to teach via distance learning effectively.
Thank you. And that leads me to a good question that one of actually our Brookings colleagues sent in. Sebastian said, distance learning has been a major challenge for teachers. However, it seems like Finland has offered a lot of learning opportunities for teachers to adapt and excel in these situations. How has this helped Finland tackle online school challenges? And I will add, and what do you think will change in the fall or in August when you reopen schools as a result of this experience?
Thank you very much. It's true that already for quite many years ago, there was quite a lot of investment in training for teachers in terms of digital competences. So, because when you talk about digitalization in schools, it cannot only be about devices or different types of digital learning platforms, but really also about teaching methods, pedagogics, of course, which should also always be at the center when we talk about teaching and education. So there has been quite a lot of opportunities for in-training courses for teachers, so they can participate while being in working life. And we've also had a system with tutor teachers, which means that you can build a network around tutor teachers who participate in certain courses concerning digital learning and who then teach teachers in their own schools or in their own municipality. And we actually, we got very good results from this tutor teacher working method. So it's also something I've mentioned as a good example in many international meetings that I've been. And I think the work that we put into this kind of paid off during the pandemic. Of course, the teachers got very little time to prepare because they basically had only one day to prepare for going into distance learning in Finland. The decision was taken at a very fast pace in March. But I really think it showed the resilience of our education system, that they actually managed to kind of reframe and rebuild their teaching methods into distance learning in just 24 hours, basically. But I also have to agree when it comes to the future, that I think really we can learn a lot. There's a lot we can do in terms of developing teaching based on what we learned from this spring. And I know that very many teachers also said that they have found new ways of teaching, that they kind of have found new ways of teaching in their own work, which they also gives them tools to work with in the fall in terms of their professional development. But education is not just about the facts that the teacher teaches. It's also about, learning to be an individual among other individuals, a human being together with other human beings. And these types of socio-emotional skills you cannot teach in the same way through digital devices. So I think it will add a lot to our teaching methods and to our education. But I think that the main idea of still keeping the students in the school during the day is not something that we are going to change in terms of the educational policy in Finland.
Thank you. And John, to build on that, do you think that in this country, because the minister mentioned in her in her earlier remarks, that how important is the teacher in Finnish society and how valued is the teaching profession and well paid and highly competitive? We know that only 1 in 10 aspiring teachers actually get a job in teaching in Finland. Do you think that there's a chance that as parents have seen firsthand the role that teachers play and how difficult it is to kind of support learning at home, that maybe in this country too, some movement will go in the direction of kind of a renewed respect and valuing of the teaching profession?
I hope so. I hope this moment has built the political will necessary, not only to raise teacher salaries, but as you say, to raise the esteem around the profession. We should be investing a lot more in teacher preparation. I think we have a lot to learn from the work that Finland has done to make teacher preparation rigorous, evidence-based, to set a high bar for entry to the teaching profession. We could do well to try to replicate some of what Finland has done there. We do have, I think, amazing teachers in the United States who've done amazing work. And I think parents have seen that too and have been inspired by that as well. So I am hopeful. Two related points. One is, I also think we have more appreciation of the role of early childhood now than before the pandemic, as I think about folks who are really struggling with how to balance work and childcare. I think there's a real appreciation, maybe among folks who were affluent and never worried about not having childcare before, a real appreciation for how vulnerable we are in the absence of access to childcare. So hopefully we'll see some significant investment there, particularly in the early childhood workforce, which is very undercompensated, disproportionately made up of women, particularly women of color, and needs a lot more investment. The other issue is that we have a real teacher diversity challenge in the country. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. I hope there's the political will to make the investment necessary to have a strong pipeline of teachers and a diverse pipeline of teachers.
Great. I'm going to turn to some questions that we have just received from our audience members. Here's one for Minister Anderson. I'm going to tailor it a little bit for how I want to pivot. Shelton asks, when hearing about the deep inequalities in American education, what suggestions do you have for U.S. education leaders? And if you can focus particularly on the issue of resource allocation and how actually decisions are made in Finland to ameliorate, the way in which different students from different backgrounds get supports. I think that would be super helpful.
Thank you very much. It's a very good question, but it's also a bit of a tricky one because, as I said, different countries have made some different education policy decisions, and some of them do influence the education system on a structural level quite a lot. And I do understand all structures are not very easy to change. In terms of resource allocation, in terms of policy choices in Finland, a few that I would like to point out is firstly, again, the role of teachers, actually, because we know from studies and evaluation that has been done that it's really an important factor in terms of ensuring high quality education in the whole of the country. So in all schools, in all cities, also in the rural areas and so on, because and also, if you talk about how the teaching profession is valued in society, you really need input from all of society. So it's about the universities and the educational background. It's about opportunities for training while working. It's about your salary and so on. It's about a multitude of things that together form the way the teaching profession is valued in society. The role of early childhood education and care is something that we are emphasizing a lot in Finland, because all the research data that we have show that it has a huge impact in terms of equality in primary education. But we do have a challenge here in Finland in terms of the enrollment rate in early childhood education and care. So I'm not saying that we are doing everything perfectly here in that regard, but we do know that it has a huge impact. And I think it's especially important to make sure that all families, for example, can afford to enroll in early childhood education and care, and that you also have university-trained teachers working in kindergartens and in early childhood education and care, because you kind of set the foundation for the later years in primary education. And on top of this, I also have to point out that one big difference between Finland and the US is, of course, that we have a public common system of education for everyone. And I do think it's a big structural advantage. I think it's an important factor, because when you have a situation where parents are choosing schools for their children, and you have a situation where children from certain areas and cities go to certain schools, it creates structural inequalities that are quite hard to break once they are there. But one thing I want to add still is a way that we have worked also with resource allocation within our public education system, where we have been allocating more state funding to schools located in areas where unemployment is higher, for example. And thus, there is a saying in Finland talking about positive discrimination in a way, but thus allocating more funds to areas that are in bigger needs of them than the schools located in areas where employment is high, and you can see that the overall educational background of adults in the area is higher. So giving more money to the schools in poorer areas.
Thank you. So that leads me to the question that Emiola, one of our audience members, sent. She asked to Secretary King, how much would you say the funding system of K-12 schools has continued to support the disparities that we see existing in education in America? In your opinion, do you think a funding system that is not based on the wealth of localities will help reduce the disparities in education? Are there any lessons the U.S. can learn from Finland with regard to funding?
Yes. So, what the minister just described, putting more resources to the kids who have the greatest needs, that is exactly what we should be doing in this country, but we are doing the opposite. We are actually spending much more on affluent students. We did a study at the Education Trust that showed that communities with large numbers of students of color are spending $1,800 less per student than communities with very few students of color. And when you go state by state, you can see disparities between neighboring districts of $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, even $10,000, $15,000 per student per year. And those differences add up to differences in program quality, differences in access to enrichment opportunities. So we do need to rethink how we fund our schools. Property taxes are a huge problem. We fund our schools largely at the local level through property taxes. And that locks in disparities in school spending. We also have a lot of school districts in many states. And when you have a lot of school districts, I think about the Long Island region of New York, where there are 120 school districts. So the school districts then track lines of race and class, and you get these very large disparities. States with county systems, like Maryland, have an advantage there because you have a broader tax base. But we really do need to rethink school funding. The organization EdBuild has shown that the per student differences in spending based on race translate into $23 billion less per year being spent on students of color. We can do better, and we ought to rethink how we're organized along the lines of what the minister described, making the investment where kids are most vulnerable.
Thank you for that. Fiona wrote a question that I know is top of the mind for the US audience. Here goes, Minister Anderson. When schools in Finland reopened in mid-May, what safety measures were in place to ensure the health and safety of both the students and the teachers? Were face masks, social distancing, etc., mandatory?
Yes, well, we had instructions for the education providers who were made in cooperation with the National Institute for Health and Welfare. And basically, going to school was quite different if you compare it to a normal or the time before the pandemic. All the school providers were obliged to try and keep the classes apart during the day. So there was social distancing between classes, but we did not tell them to try and upkeep, say, social distancing in terms of 2 meters or 1.5 meters between the students. Because if I go to a teacher and say, you should keep these 7-year-olds 2 meters apart from each other during the day, this teacher will tell me rightly that it is an impossible task. So that's why the main instruction was to keep the classes apart, so that students will only study during the day with their own class and with their own teacher, and that they will also eat and be outside for recess separately during the day. So if there is a case with a young student or a child getting the virus, the students who are being put in quarantine would only be in her own or his or her own class, not in half of the school, for example. And this meant, since general upper secondary level was still in distance learning throughout the end of May, many municipalities used libraries, they used youth facilities, they used different education facilities to kind of spread out the students in the classes more broadly than normally. And then there was also instructions, of course, around hand hygiene, washing hands several times during the day, and so on. But we managed with these instructions, and the National Institute for Health did an evaluation of the effects of reopening the schools in Finland, and their finding was that it did not have an impact on the spread of the virus. So there were not more cases in Finland because of this. But of course, the challenge is always that the general situation concerning the pandemic is, of course, the factor that affects the most. But we had no data from the other Nordic countries either of this virus being spread in school or kindergartens. So for some reason, at least according to the scientific data that we have, it looks as if though children do not spread the virus to the same extent that adults do.
That's super interesting. Secretary King, one of our audience members, Asha, sent this question. Can you share an example of a resource that can help manage the socio-emotional challenges that students face that could be included in a Congress bill?
Yes, let me first add just one point to Minister Anderson's points about the reopening of school. Part of the backdrop is having a good system of testing and contact tracing in place and having universal access to healthcare. One of the unique challenges for the United States is because the federal government has done such a poor job on managing the pandemic, and we don't have adequate testing and contact tracing in place, and because we have an underlying health system with extraordinary disparities in access and quality of service, it is much harder for us to navigate the school component of this public health crisis because our overall public health context isn't what it should be. On socio-emotional needs, two things that would be very helpful for Congress to dedicate funding towards. One is counselors. The American School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 250 students to one counselor. We have states where the ratio is more like 500 students, 600 students to one counselor. How could a counselor possibly provide adequate support in that context? So we ought to have funding to make sure that we have the counselors that we need. We also need funding for mental health services. And those mental health services should be available to kids, to families that desperately need access to mental health care, and to school staff who also, many of whom have experienced either the traumatic impact of the COVID-19 health crisis or the COVID-19 economic crisis. Dedicated funding for socio-emotional needs would be a very important step for Congress to undertake, along with the general state stabilization funding that's needed to avoid cuts.
Thank you for that. And I'll turn to Minister Anderson and kind of ask, how has Finland addressed kind of that part of socio-emotional support to teachers and students that probably got exacerbated and deepened during the crisis? But also tie it with a question that we received from Catherine, who is interested in learning how Finland has addressed the needs of children who receive special education services during the pandemic. And I know before we went live, we were talking about decisions that were made even to continue serving students with learning disabilities or other types of disabilities during the pandemic school closures. Can you speak a little bit about those two?
Yeah, maybe I can start out with that theme. When we closed the school facilities and switched to distance learning, we told all families that there were some children who still had the right and the possibility to participate in teaching in the school buildings. And these were children of a young age. It means children who cannot stay at home by themselves during the day in case their parents do not have the possibility for distance working from distance. And also children with special needs. So they had the right to be in school throughout the school closure, throughout the 8 weeks. But only, according to data, only 5% of children with special needs actually use this opportunity or this right. Largely because, of course, their parents were concerned about the virus and wanted to have their children at home if they had a possibility for that. But there was a lot of concerns also among teachers about the effects of the school closures and the distance learning, especially for children with special needs who also during normal circumstances do get a lot of pedagogical support, special education teachers, for example, for their learning, and who are now at home getting the support from their parents, yes, but their parents were usually not trained pedagogical professionals and did maybe not have the same kind of skills or capabilities to support their children in their learning. But I think also in the Finnish parliament, they stressed the importance that there was this possibility for children with special needs and also for the younger children, because we really didn't want any child to kind of be left alone at home if the circumstances and the conditions were not suitable enough for their learning. Now, when it comes to mental health and so socio-emotional support, a part of the funding from the children's support package goes specifically to these services. We have psychologists and student counselors working in the schools. And we are, of course, expecting there to be a bigger need for these services in the fall compared to normal circumstances. And that's why we have told the municipalities to use the funding that they are getting now, the additional funding for these types of services, also addressing mental health services on the public health side. I also have to stress that what John said around the system of testing and tracing is very true. Without a well-functioning system of testing and tracing, we would not have been able to remove any of the restrictions that we had in place in terms of the pandemic. So it really has a huge importance. And in Finland, we have been able to test anyone with symptoms. So anyone with any kind of symptoms have had the possibility through the public health system to get the test, which means that no matter if we are talking about a child or an adult, if you have any kind of symptoms, it can turn out to be just a normal flu, but if you have any kind of symptoms, you should go to the test immediately, which means that we will also be able to trace people who have been around this person as fast as possible. And this was really, I think for each country, this is an essential part of the strategy in terms of coming out of, or in terms of the exit strategy.
Thank you for that. And I think the last question for the 2 minutes we have left, I'll give John one that, Secretary King, one that Torben sent, which is, I think, a good one to end. He asked, are education leaders in the U.S. becoming more willing to seek inspiration in other countries like Finland or Singapore?
Not as quickly as we probably should. I mean, I think there are such important lessons from Finland, from Singapore, not only about schools, but about children and families and how we could better support children and families as a society. And I think this is something that teacher preparation, principal preparation, superintendent preparation programs ought to do a lot more of, learning from other countries. The minister talked about the work to address learning loss. The UK is launching a national tutoring corps to try to help address learning loss. We could learn from that. There are countries that have, like Finland, taken a more serious approach to teacher preparation and teacher training, not only early in the career, but through the early years of the career and induction support and career ladder opportunities like the tutor teachers that the minister described. We could learn from that. We could replicate those things. So we have not been as quick to learn from other countries as we should be. We can be somewhat parochial at times, I think. And we ought to do a lot more international sharing. It's one of the reasons I'm glad to have Emiliana, you doing the work that you're doing at Brookings to try to share international learning around how we best support our kids.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. We have been at Brookings really honored, and I can tell from the questions we've received from the audience that we may have to follow up and maybe tap you one more time to see if you can provide some additional answers to really interesting questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time today, but I really appreciate, and on behalf of Brookings and the Center for Universal Education, we really appreciate the time that you've devoted to this conversation, and I hope that it will change some minds around the world and prioritize our children. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.